With this lecture, I want to just take a few minutes and go over the concepts of glomerular filtration and the glomerular filtration rate. We'll cover this also in lecture, but I want to give you kind of a beginning overview of it so that it'll go a little bit smoother when we talk about it in lecture. We've already talked about what we mean by glomerular filtration. That's what's really happening here at step 1. The blood flows in the afferent arteriole. Due to the pressures that are in there, and we'll look at those pressures in just a moment, fluid is pushed out of the capillary bed and into Bowman's capsule. This then goes in through the tubules, and so what we have here, this yellow, is just taking that nephron, the loop of Henle and the proximal and distal convoluted tubules, and just stretching it out. But what you've got happening is the fluid enters in here, so that filtrate enters in, we have the reabsorption and the secretion. But this lecture is focusing on really what's happening primarily right here in the glomerulus. So here we've got glomerular filtration pressure. This concept should be very familiar to you. It is the same thing that we've looked at before when we looked at capillary filtration pressures back in chapter 21. We really are talking about 3 forces here though instead of 4. So it's a similar concept. You've got blood that enters into the capillary bed coming in an afferent arteriole. The difference being, of course, is that we didn't have an afferent and efferent arteriole when we talked about regular capillary beds. We simply had the arterioles leading into the capillaries, and then at the venous end we had the venous capillaries and then moving back out. We don't have a venous structure here, but we have a vessel in and a vessel out. And so what you have first is what we refer to as a glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure. So we give it a slightly different acronym, but it's really the same thing as a blood hydrostatic pressure, except this is blood coming in specifically into the glomeruli within all of the nephrons of the kidney. So this pressure is quite high, and we'll talk for just a second, in just a second, about why that pressure is higher than normally what you would see at other capillary beds in the body. But the blood flows in and it pushes fluid out of the capillaries into Bowman's capsule here, as I just mentioned. At the same time, within that blood, you still have the albumin that creates the colloid osmotic pressure, the same as what you would find really anywhere else in the body. This might be a little bit lower than what we've seen the same author using slightly lower values than he did in chapter 21, primarily because with the nature of the glomerulus, with the pedicels and podocytes and those little filtration slits, it is possible for a little more albumin to get out than what you might have found in a regular capillary, a continuous capillary bed throughout the body. These openings are fairly large, so there might be a little more chance of some albumin loss. So the blood colloid osmotic pressure might be slightly less than elsewhere in the body. It's still a significant force. And then if you'll recall, at the other capillary beds, we had interstitial fluid pressures, interstitial osmotic pressure and interstitial hydrostatic pressure. The osmotic pressure isn't really a factor here, because any particles, any proteins, electrolytes, anything that might be released into the fluid is really going to flow. It's going to be drawn into the capsule, again, because of the nature of diffusion and the concentration gradient. Any solutes are going to be pulled this way. Fluid has a tendency to obviously be pulled this way as well, because there is a force pushing it. But at the same time, you do have a capsular hydrostatic pressure, or like I said before, it would have been interstitial hydrostatic pressure. That's considerably higher than what you find elsewhere in the body. And that's because of the nature of the capsule itself. It provides a wall in which fluid that gets out here starts to build up and applies a pressure back onto the capillary. So there's a weight of fluid pushing back in here. So that in the end you have a push out, a push in, and a pull in. And so you can see the arrows demonstrating the way the fluids move. So you have to be able to calculate net filtration pressure here. This is, again, the same concept as what we've done before. You will have to calculate this on the final exam. So you need to know it's really the glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure, or blood hydrostatic pressure, and then subtract from it both the capsular hydrostatic pressure and the blood colloid osmotic pressure. So they listed this way. You could have also added these two together and then subtracted them both. The math here is probably simpler, just showing minus to minus. in the end, you'll see that the net filtration pressure is considerably higher here. It's at 10 millimeters of mercury, and you don't have to have these specific numbers memorized, but take note that at the rest of the tissues in the body, our values were around 1 to 2. That's appropriate with lymphatic vessels picking up that excess fluid and returning that fluid back into the blood supply. But here in the glomerulus, we need that to be considerably higher because we want fluid being filtered through the nephron, through the tubules, so that we can in fact clean up our blood, so to speak. So that's glomerular filtration pressure. So this is the process. These are the values that you, or the concepts that you need to know in order to do this equation. This kind of just shows, it's right out of the book, just kind of showing the sequence of steps that go through it, the stimulus, the receptors, and we're going to talk about what this means. I put this in here just because it is part of the pictures that are in the book, and it points out some important cells that affect how we control glomerular filtration pressure, and we're going to talk about them now. But you'll notice the macula densa cells are in here, the juxtaglomerular apparatus, the factors within effectors within the afferent arteriole. All of those are going to be factors that affect glomerular filtration pressure and glomerular filtration rate. Now, this is the summary table. I don't have another slide really to take you through, but all of the terminology and all the factors that affect glomerular filtration rate are listed here. So let's be sure we define glomerular filtration rate. It's the amount of filtrate, how much fluid is formed per minute. And let me back you up 1 second. This was glomerular filtration pressure. So this was a value in millimeters of mercury. So it's a pressure value. Glomerular filtration rate is actually going to be a volume factor. Now, we don't calculate glomerular filtration rate per se in terms of volume. You will not need to do that, but you will need to understand what things increase glomerular filtration rate and which things decrease glomerular filtration rate. And so the good news is they're summarized for you here in the table, but let me take you through what each of these are. And again, these are things that control glomerular filtration rate. And the first few things that we're looking at are under the category of renal autoregulation. Renal autoregulation, or renal regulation, is basically the fact that the kidney has its own feedback mechanisms, 2 of them here, that control rate itself. So the kidney auto controls some of the glomerular filtration rate. You will see that there is also effects outside the kidney. That's what the neural regulation is, and the hormonal regulation. So there are ways to control glomerular filtration rate outside the kidney itself. It's still going to target the kidney, but it's being generated from somewhere outside the kidney. But the kidney itself also recognizes and controls this rate. Now let me back up for just 1 second because I want to show you that this is just a nice picture to look at. So forget the values and things here, and just let's take a look at what we've got here with the glomerulus. You should note, and I think I mentioned this to some extent in class already, that the afferent arteriole is wider. So there actually is more blood coming in than there is blood going out. If you look in terms of volume moving in and out, it's being controlled. If you have a larger tube in and a smaller tube out, blood will tend to back up a little bit. It's kind of like saying if I have 100 people I need to move through a room and I let them in through a door that's double doors, and I say, okay, we have to go across this hall and then out a single door, they'll back up a little bit. You can only get so many through a single wide door, as opposed to double doors. And so that's kind of the idea. It backs up a little bit, and this is what generates a greater pressure that exists already within the glomerulus, which I mentioned before. The 55 millimeters of mercury is a little higher than what you see at other capillary beds in the body. So the reason for that, it's important. I often ask that. Why is the capsular or glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure higher than what you see elsewhere in the body under normal circumstances? And that's because of that wider afferent and narrower efferent. And again, I'm saying A and E so that you understand me clearly which vessel I'm talking about. Now, looking at this same structure, and actually, let's see if I've got... I'm going to back up way further here. I want the picture here that shows our macula densa cells. And remember, we've got the ascending limb of the loop of Henle coming through here. So working off of the idea of renal autoregulation of GFR, the first thing I want to talk about is the myogenic mechanism. So what's happening in the myogenic mechanism, it's like a stretch reflex. If we stretch something, stretch a muscle, it'll kind of spring back. That's kind of the idea of preload. Remember, in the heart, preload was the degree of stretch on the ventricles, and then it would spring back. And I gave you that example of with a rubber band. If I pull back more, the more likely it is to spring back and stretch or spring the rubber band further. It's the same idea. That's more or less what we're seeing happening with the myogenic mechanism. It's a stretch trigger. What happens is, as the blood flows in, so if we have an increase in blood volume and blood pressure, that will increase the glomerular filtration rate. So or glomerular filtration pressure. The more blood that's coming in here, the more it stretches the muscles, the smooth muscles on the wall of the afferent arteriole. By stretching the walls, these smooth muscles on the wall of the afferent arteriole will actually contract and narrow the opening. So if the pressure starts to increase beyond what we would consider the normal range, that increased volume in here causes a stretch of these smooth muscle cells. Remember that afferent arteriole, it's not quite the same as the capillary that's lost the smooth muscle layer and is just endothelium and basement membrane. We have a layer of smooth muscle cells right here. And as the volume increases, causes a stretch that then triggers a contraction. Doesn't contract it close, but it narrows the opening. It's a very quick response. So if something increases blood volume and blood pressure fairly rapidly, the kidneys respond fairly quickly. This is an important concept because if the glomerular filtration rate increases too high, what you have is you have more blood being pushed in here, which means you produce more filtrate. When you produce more filtrate because of the greater pressure, the fluid also moves faster through the tubules of the nephron, through the proximal convoluted tubule, down the loop of Henle, back up the distal convoluted tubule, and then we're really coming back up here, right, up this ascending limb. And so if filtrate starts moving, if there's too much of it, and it's moving too fast through there, what'll happen is reabsorption. Remember this process here. The reabsorption that needs to take place will slow down. Less will be reabsorbed. If less is reabsorbed, that means more electrolytes, possibly some proteins, and even some glucose are going to find its way out here into the ascending limb, heading to the distal convoluted tubule and out to become urine. And we'll lose some of the ions and molecule substances that we need. So let me say that again so that this is clear to you. If the glomerular filtration rate gets too high, you will wind up losing more substances because the fluid will move too quickly and things that should have been reabsorbed are not. So the myogenic mechanism helps with that. And then the second one, referred to as the tubuloglomerular feedback, also helps with that. In this one, if too many substances, too many ions, proteins, glucose, whatever is, and there's all sorts of the sodiums, the potassiums need to go, but if you've got sodium and chloride that was not reabsorbed, various proteins that were not reabsorbed as they should have been, there are cells here, the macula densa cells in particular, that have receptors that respond to the presence of some of those electrolytes and substances. When these macula densa cells sense that too much sodium and chloride and water have moved through, it will then trigger the juxtaglomerular cells. Notice they touch each other right here. It sends a signal to the juxtaglomerular cells to reduce the production of nitric oxide. Remember these cells within the endothelium here, the juxtaglomerular cells, and here's the endothelium lining the blood vessel. Remember, the endothelium produces the nitric oxide. So the juxtaglomerular cells inhibit the release of nitric oxide. Remember, nitric oxide is a vasodilator. So normally with normal levels of nitric oxide, this vessel dilates and more blood can come in. If too much blood is coming in, the myogenic mechanism helps, but in addition, we still have too much stuff in this tube. Macula densa cells trigger the juxtaglomerular cells for the endothelium to reduce nitric oxide. Reduced nitric oxide, you have more vasoconstriction. The dilation was inhibiting the ability for the muscles to contract. Now the muscles will contract better, and you'll slow down the glomerular filtration rate. So looking here at our table, that's the first two items on the table. Myogenic mechanism, tubuloglomerular feedback. They both decrease glomerular filtration rate. You also have neural regulation. Neural regulation refers to the function of the sympathetic nervous system. So remember, most blood vessels in the body are innervated only by sympathetic fibers under the releasing primarily norepinephrine. Norepinephrine actually also causes, in most cases, vasoconstriction, particularly on the alpha-1 receptors, which are excitatory. So if you have neural regulation, increases sympathetic activity of norepinephrine, leads to constrictions, particularly at alpha-1 receptors. If you constrict the vessel, you constrict this vessel, less blood flows in, and you wind up decreasing the glomerular filtration rate. Angiotensin II, remember the RAA pathway, another powerful vasoconstrictor. It actually constricts both the afferent and the efferent vessels. So we're constricting on both ends. We reduce the amount of blood in. Now it will constrict this as well, but you'll notice there's far less smooth muscle here. So the amount of constriction that can occur here is less. In fact, our picture doesn't hardly show any smooth muscle at all. So it's important to note that although we are saying both are affected, this is going to constrict far greater than the efferent. So you're still going to have much narrow, maybe a little bit more narrow coming up, but primarily what you're going to see is the angiotensin II decreasing GFR. And then our last hormone, a really important one here, we talked about it a little bit in the function of in chapter 21 with cardiac function and blood vessel blood pressure function. But atrial natriuretic peptide, or we should probably just call it the natriuretic peptides. There's more than one. There's more than atrial. There's B, brain natriuretic peptide, S natriuretic peptide. There's several of them. These are released from the atria of the heart based on venous return, how much blood is coming back, particularly to the right atrium, causing the stretch of the right atrium. So as blood volume and blood pressure increase, the stretch of the atrium causes a secretion of ANP. This relaxes the mesangial cells in the glomerulus, therefore increases capillary surface area available for filtration, and I just read that to you here. In other words, what happens is if we look at the glomerulus, these mesangial cells that are located here, and actually this picture doesn't show them, but there you see your mesangial cells right in between the capillaries. They relax, allowing more fluid to leave through the filtration slits, and you increase GFR because more fluid can now move out. The capillary is more porous, and you'll increase the amount of filtrate. So this is important stuff. These are all testable contents. What kinds of things increase GFR? What kinds of things decrease GFR? Autoregulation or renal regulation, neural regulation, and then the hormones, all affecting glomerular filtration rate. And then finally, the thing I would like to show here is approximately what it is. I told you we don't really calculate it. I'm just giving you a value of approximately 105 to 125 milliliters a minute. Don't really have to have that number memorized. If I need you to know what normal is, I'll put it on the exam itself. So that's a value you don't need to have memorized. You do need to know that if it's too high, reabsorption's compromised. I already mentioned that to you. What I hadn't mentioned is what happens when it's too low. If it's too low, then the fluid moves too slowly through the tubules, and we will reabsorb things that should have been excreted in the urine. We probably shouldn't have kept all that sodium. We probably have some waste products that found their way back in that should have gone out. So low glomerular filtration rate is always also a problem. Now, anything that affects net filtration will affect the glomerular filtration rate. So if we lose blood colloid osmotic pressure, something like liver disease where we stop making albumin, this is going to be a problem. And then really the thing I want you to know here, and here's where we've already looked at mean arterial pressure, we've already learned this formula. We'll practice some when we get into class, but there's a really important factor I want you to know here. There's a statement that says as long as mean arterial pressure is between 80 and 180, GFR, glomerular filtration rate, is somewhat constant, and that's true. Because of those mechanisms we just talked about, when The mean arterial pressure still stays within this 80 to 180 range. We really do see the kidneys still functioning fairly well. But if we drop below 80, we will see kidney failure, and likewise above 180. It takes quite a bit to get above 180. So I give you a normal blood pressure here, remembering what the mean arterial pressure, remember we also looked at it as cardiac output times resistance, but resistance is a hard thing to measure. So we look at the blood pressure and take the values of the blood pressure to determine mean arterial pressure. Remember, this is the average blood pressure throughout the arteries of the body. So for 120 over 80, mean arterial pressure is 93.33, well within that normal range. If I have a high blood pressure, I'm at 160 over 90, that's hypertension. I'm still only at 113.33, so I can go quite a bit higher and still let my kidneys function normal. But if I drop down to 80 over 50, which is a low pressure but still a functional pressure, but my mean arterial pressure now is below at 60, I now have real concerns about my kidney function. Am I really cleaning the things out of my blood that I'm supposed to? So, important to be able to calculate this. This is a formula you have to know. It is something you absolutely will be asked to calculate on the final exam.